I came home after 7 days on the road and found my wife on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor with our 8-month-old strapped to her back. My brother and his girlfriend were sitting at my dining room table playing cards, 3 feet away. I stood in the doorway for about 10 seconds. Nobody looked up. Then I said the words that changed everything in that house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 31 years driving commercial routes for a regional freight company out of central Tennessee, Nashville to Memphis, Memphis to Knoxville. Sometimes as far as Little Rock or Birmingham when they're short on drivers. It's not the kind of work people romanticize. It's early mornings, truck stop coffee, way stations, and paperwork that follows you home. But it's honest work, and it paid for the house I own outright on a quiet street in Murfreesboro. 3 bedrooms, a covered back porch, a garden Claire planted the first spring after we moved in. Claire is my wife. She's 49. She teaches 2nd grade at an elementary school about 6 miles from the house. Patient in the way that only people who work with young children can be. The kind of woman who remembers every student's birthday and keeps granola bars in her desk for the kids who come in hungry. She cried when she found out she was pregnant at 48, not from sadness, from disbelief. We had stopped expecting it. Our son James was born healthy and loud and perfect. The trouble started 4 months after James arrived, when my brother Dennis called from Chattanooga. Dennis is 53. He's held maybe a dozen jobs since he turned 30. Warehouse work, landscaping, a stint selling insurance, a few months at a call center. Nothing ever lasted. He always had an explanation that sounded reasonable for about 15 minutes. His girlfriend Patty was the same way. The two of them had been together for 3 years, and in that time I had loaned Dennis money I never saw again on 4 separate occasions. When he called, he said they'd been evicted. He said it wasn't his fault. He said they just needed a few weeks to get back on their feet. I should have said no. I knew that even as I said yes. But Dennis is my only living family besides Claire and James, and there's a particular guilt that comes with being the one who made it when the other one didn't. I told him 6 weeks. I said I'd help him look for work. I set up the guest room. 6 weeks became 3 months. I want to be fair to myself when I tell this story, because I've spent a long time being unfair. The truth is I wasn't home enough to see what was happening, clearly. I left Sunday nights and came back Thursday evenings or Friday mornings, depending on the load schedule. That's a lot of hours where I was trusting that the adults in my house were behaving like adults. They weren't. I started to notice things in pieces, small things that didn't quite add up. Claire seemed tired in a way that went beyond the usual exhaustion of having a baby. When I'd call in the evenings, she'd sound strained, and then she'd change her voice when she heard James making noise in the background, like she'd been trained to hide the strain. I asked her once if everything was okay. She said yes. She said Dennis and Patty were fine, a little messy, but fine. I accepted that because I wanted to. The night I came home and found her scrubbing the floor with James on her back, something inside me finally stopped accepting things. I dropped my bag by the front door. I walked into the kitchen. Claire looked up and tried to smile. James reached his arms toward me from the carrier. Dennis looked over from the card game, gave me a nod. Patty said, "Oh, hey, Robert. We didn't hear you pull in." I looked at my wife on her knees on the tile floor. I looked at the two of them at my dining room table. I said, "Dennis, Patty, I need you both to start making arrangements. You have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to be." Patty's expression didn't change right away. Dennis set down his cards slowly. "What?" "2 weeks," I said, "starting today." Then I walked over to Claire, helped her up from the floor, took James from the carrier, and carried my son into the living room. Behind me, I heard Dennis say my name twice. I didn't answer. That night, after James was asleep and Claire was finally sitting still for the first time all day, I asked her to tell me the truth. All of it, not the version she'd been editing to keep me from worrying on the road. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't want to be the reason you stopped helping your brother." That sentence hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for, because what it told me was that Claire had spent months absorbing whatever was happening in that house in order to protect me from a choice she didn't think she had the right to force. I told her I needed to hear it anyway. She started slow. Then it came out in pieces. Then all at once. Dennis and Patty treated the house like a hotel. Dishes left for days. Laundry taken out of the dryer and piled on top instead of folded. Food eaten without replacing it. The living room occupied every evening with the television loud enough that James couldn't settle. Claire had asked twice, politely, if they could keep the volume lower during his bedtime routine. The first time Dennis said sure and nothing changed. The second time Patty said, "Babies have to learn to sleep through noise anyway." But that wasn't the part that kept Claire up at night. The comments were. Patty had a way of saying things that sounded almost like observations. "You know, I read that breastfeeding is actually harder for older mothers." Or, walking past Claire folding laundry, "I could never handle staying home all day. I'd go crazy." Or once, when Claire mentioned being tired, Patty laughed and said, "Well, you did choose to do this at your age." Claire said she'd told herself it wasn't intentional, that Patty just didn't think before she spoke. But there was a pattern to it. It always landed on the same things: Claire's age, Claire's appearance since the pregnancy, Claire's choices. Always casual, always deniable, always just loud enough for Dennis to hear without him ever saying anything. I asked her what Dennis said when it happened. She looked down at her hands. "He usually laughs." I went to bed that night and didn't sleep. The next morning I called in and told dispatch I needed 2 personal days. I had the kind of accumulated leave that comes from 3 decades of rarely using it. They told me to take the week if I needed it. I said 2 days was fine. I want to be honest about what I did next, because this is the part of the story I'm least proud of. I didn't confront Dennis. I didn't sit him down and tell him what Claire had shared with me. Instead, I got quiet. I made coffee and I watched. I told myself I was being methodical. The truth is, part of me still wasn't ready to believe it was as bad as it sounded. By noon, I had my answer. Claire was in the nursery with James when I heard Patty on her phone in the hallway. She wasn't whispering. She said, "Honestly, it's not even that hard here. Claire does everything. I think she's one of those women who just can't stop performing." A pause. Then Patty laughed. "No, she won't say anything. She's too worried about Robert's feelings." You know how wives get. I stood completely still in the kitchen with a coffee mug in my hand. Performing. She had used the word performing about a woman who was teaching school 4 days a week, nursing a baby, cooking meals, cleaning a house, and carrying the weight of 2 adults who couldn't be bothered to put their own dishes in the sink. I set the mug down very carefully. I didn't say anything then. I had learned something in 31 years of logistics work. You don't make a move until you understand the full picture. Reacting to half of it is how things go sideways. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding. I went through 3 months of our joint account and the household credit card I'd given Dennis access to for what I called genuine emergencies. The charges were not genuine emergencies. A steakhouse in downtown Nashville. A weekend reservation at a hotel 40 minutes from our house, which I can only assume was their idea of a staycation. Clothing purchases. A wine subscription. A spa charge that I stared at for a long time. Taken individually, each charge was something a person could explain away. Together they told a story. While Claire was stretching our grocery budget because she knew I was carrying the mortgage, the truck payment, and Dennis's share of the utilities, Patty was treating the backup card like a bonus. I closed the laptop. I sat at my desk in the dark for a while. Then I heard them talking in the guest room. The door wasn't closed all the way. I wasn't trying to listen. But I heard Dennis say my name, and then I heard him say something that clarified everything I needed to know about the 6 weeks that had become 3 months. "Robert feels guilty about me," he said. "He always has. We've got more time than we think." Patty said something I couldn't make out. Dennis answered, "He's not going to throw his own brother out. Trust me, he never has." I walked back to the kitchen. I poured the rest of my coffee down the drain. I thought about my father, who died when Dennis and I were in our 30s. And who told me once, in a rare quiet moment, that the worst thing you can do for someone who won't stand on their own is keep holding them up. I had always assumed he was talking about someone else. It took me until that night in Murfreesboro to understand he might have been talking about me. The next morning, I had a conversation with Claire that I should have had weeks earlier. I waited until James was down for his morning nap. I made sure we were alone. I told her that I'd heard Patty on the phone. I told her about the credit card. I told her what I'd heard Dennis say through the door. She wasn't surprised. That was the part that hurt the most. She had known all of this, in some form, for a long time. She had just decided that it wasn't hers to hand to me. I told her I was sorry. I told her I should have paid closer attention. I told her that I'd been so focused on not letting my brother fail that I had let her carry something she should never have been handed. She didn't cry. She just nodded. Then she said, "Just tell me what you're thinking." I told her. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Okay," she said. "I trust you." I want every husband listening to understand what that moment meant to me. Not because she gave me permission, but because she'd been waiting, without asking, for a long time for me to show up in the right way. And she still trusted me after I'd been late. Over the following 2 weeks, I became a different version of myself in that house. Quieter, more present. I worked my 2 days back on the road and came home earlier than expected. I paid attention in a way I had failed to do before. What I observed confirmed everything Claire had told me, and then some. One morning, Dennis slept until 10:30 while Claire got up at 6 with James, fed him, dressed him, made breakfast, and had already folded a load of laundry before Dennis wandered into the kitchen looking for coffee that Claire had made an hour earlier. He poured himself a cup without a word. Didn't ask about James, didn't ask about Claire. Picked up his phone and walked back toward the guest room. Claire watched him go. Then she turned back to the dishes. The expression on her face wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was the face of someone who had completely stopped expecting anything different. One afternoon, I came in through the garage and found Patty at the kitchen table with a magazine while James sat in his bouncer fussing. Claire was in the back room on a work call. I could hear through the door that she was dealing with something stressful, a parent of one of her students. The call was clearly going long. James was getting louder. Patty turned a page. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her not move for 90 seconds. Then I walked over, picked James up, and carried him outside to the back porch. He settled almost immediately. I sat in the chair Claire had put out there in the spring, and I held my son, and I thought about what kind of household I was running. The answer wasn't a comfortable one. 2 days later, I had lunch with a longtime friend named Gary, who is also an attorney. We went to a diner near his office in Smyrna. I told him the whole situation over club sandwiches and bad coffee. Gary didn't give me legal advice exactly. He just asked questions. What was my goal? What did I want the outcome to look like? Was I trying to preserve the relationship with my brother, or was I trying to protect my family? I said I wanted both. Gary nodded slowly and ate a French fry. Then he said, "Robert, in my experience, you rarely get both. But you can usually choose which one you regret less." I drove home with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat beside me. The final push came in a way I didn't expect. Dennis and Patty had a habit of taking calls in the kitchen in the evenings. Claire and I would usually be in the living room with James. One Thursday night, I stepped into the hallway to get a glass of water and heard Patty on the phone with someone, a friend by the sound of it, voice completely relaxed, no awareness that the house was small and sound carried. "She's just so desperate to seem like everything's fine," Patty said. "It's almost sad, like she needs everyone to think she's handling it perfectly. The new baby, the house, being married to someone who's gone half the time." A pause. "Oh, she's fine. She's got that teacher thing, you know, very together on the outside. But I honestly think she resents Robert for leaving so much, and she's just too scared to say it." I stood in the hallway. She was constructing a version of my wife, a woman who was secretly falling apart, a woman whose patience was really performance, a woman who resented me. It was precise and it was false, and it was being delivered casually to whoever was on that phone like it was obvious and established. I went back to the living room. Claire was reading. James was asleep on her chest. I looked at the two of them for a moment. Then I went to bed and I finished making my decision. My in-laws on Claire's side are a large family from eastern Kentucky. Her parents are gone, but she has 3 aunts, 2 uncles, a crowd of cousins, and a sister named Diane who has strong opinions and zero patience for nonsense. Every October, they gather for a long weekend at a campground near Cumberland Gap that the family has rented for something like 20 years. It's a tradition that predates Claire and me getting together. This year, Dennis and Patty had been invited along as family. Dennis had seemed unusually enthusiastic about going. I found out later he'd been telling people that he and Patty were practically running the Callahan household while I was on the road, that they were a kind of anchor for Claire during a hard season. He'd been building a version of the story that positioned him generously. On the drive to Cumberland Gap, Patty was cheerful in the way people get when they're certain they've already won something. I was quiet. Claire held my hand on the center console. She knew something was coming. I had told her enough that she wasn't going in blind. The first afternoon was normal. Kids running around, relatives catching up, the smell of wood smoke from the fire pit. Claire's sister Diane found us within the first hour. She hugged Claire for a long time and then looked at her face carefully, the way older sisters do. Something passed between them without a word being said. That evening after dinner, when everyone was settled around the fire, Dennis made a move I had been expecting. He started talking, telling a story about these past few months, how tough it had been, how he and Patty had really been there for us, how Robert traveled so much that it was really their presence that helped keep Claire steady. He was good at it. He had a gentle, self-deprecating way of delivering the story that made it sound humble while painting himself as essential. A few cousins nodded. Claire's Uncle Ray looked thoughtful. Then Dennis said something that went one step too far. He said, "Claire's had a hard time adjusting, honestly. The baby, Robert's schedule, we've really tried to carry some of that weight." Claire went very still beside me. Diane looked at her sister. Then Diane said, very calmly, "Claire, honey, what's actually been going on?" The fire crackled. A few people shifted. Dennis's comfortable expression flickered just slightly. Claire looked at her sister. Then she looked at me. I gave her a small nod, not telling her what to do, just telling her I was there. She took a breath, and she started talking. Not dramatically. Claire doesn't do dramatic. She teaches 7-year-olds. She is precise and she is clear, and when she decides to say something true, she says it in a way that leaves no room for misinterpretation. She described what the past 3 months had looked like from inside the house. The division of labor, what she did every day. What Dennis and Patty did. She said it without anger in her voice, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. She talked about coming home from a full day of teaching, walking into a kitchen she'd cleaned before she left that was now a mess, starting dinner with James on her hip because no one had thought to start it or watch him. She mentioned the comments about her age, about her appearance, about her choices. She mentioned the morning she had a low-grade fever and still made breakfast for 4 adults because no one offered. She mentioned the afternoon she was trying to get James to sleep, walking him back and forth in his room, and could hear Patty laughing loudly at something on her phone in the next room, and how she had stood in that doorway with her son and cried quietly for about 5 minutes before pulling herself back together. The fire was very quiet. Then Claire mentioned something she hadn't told me before. One evening when I was on the road, she'd asked Patty if she could please watch James for 30 minutes so Claire could take a shower and eat something without holding him. Patty had said she would. Claire handed James over. 12 minutes later, Patty knocked on the bathroom door and said she had a headache and handed him back. Claire sat in the bathroom for a few more minutes with the shower still running. Diane's jaw was tight. Uncle Ray put his coffee down. Dennis tried to say something. He started with, "I mean, it wasn't exactly like that." Diane looked at him. "Dennis, stop talking." He stopped. That was the moment the room shifted. Because everyone there had known Claire her whole life. They knew her as someone who did not complain, someone who solved problems quietly and showed up for everyone else and asked for almost nothing. And here she was, sitting by a fire in eastern Kentucky, telling the truth in a steady voice, and the room understood that if this woman was saying it out loud, things had been genuinely hard. Patty tried next. She said people were misremembering. She said it was a stressful situation for everyone. She said Claire had always seemed fine. Uncle Ray said, "Fine isn't the same as being fine." Silence. Then I reached into the bag I'd carried to the fire, and I took out a folder. I passed it to Diane first, then to Uncle Ray. Printed credit card statements. 3 months of charges on the card I'd given Dennis for emergencies. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Diane looked through 2 pages. Then she closed the folder and set it on her knee and looked at Dennis. "How much of this did you pay back?" she asked. Dennis didn't answer. Patty started to speak, and Diane said, very quietly, "I'm asking Dennis." Another long silence. What happened next was not the dramatic confrontation you might expect. It was something quieter and more final. One by one, people drifted into smaller conversations. A cousin took Claire aside and talked to her for a long time near the tree line. Uncle Ray asked Dennis to take a walk, and the two of them were gone for about 20 minutes. When they came back, Dennis's whole posture had changed. Patty sat alone at the edge of the fire for a while. Nobody came to sit with her. Late that night, when Claire and I were in our tent with James asleep between us, she said, "I didn't think I was going to be able to say all of that." "You were incredible," I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I just got tired of protecting everyone except myself." That sentence has stayed with me every single day since. Dennis and Patty were gone from the house within 10 days of coming home from Cumberland Gap. Dennis barely spoke to me the morning they packed up. He carried boxes to their car without making eye contact. Patty was efficient and tight-lipped. No goodbye to James. That last part said everything. The house felt different immediately. Larger somehow, even though nothing had changed. That first evening after they left, Claire sat on the back porch while I made dinner. First time she'd sat outside in the evening in months without laundry or baby gear in her hands. Just sitting. Just watching the yard. I brought her a glass of iced tea and sat beside her. She said, "I forgot what it sounded like when the house was ours." I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. James figured it out before either of us. Within 2 weeks, he was sleeping longer stretches. He fussed less in the evenings. Our pediatrician said it almost casually at his 9-month checkup that babies are more attuned to household stress than most people realize. I thought about that driving home. Dennis called about a month later. He was working again, he said. A warehouse position in Chattanooga. His voice sounded smaller than I'd heard it in a long time. He asked how Claire was. I told him she was doing well. He said, "I know I handled things badly." I said, "I know you do." There was a long pause. He said, "I'm sorry, Robert." I believed him. That surprised me a little. I thought I'd have more resistance to it. But Dennis has never been a bad person. He has just spent a long time taking the path of least resistance and landing in the homes of people who loved him. That's a different problem than being cruel. It doesn't excuse what happened, but it changes how I carry it. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I hoped the job stuck. I told him he was welcome at Christmas if he wanted to come. I have not extended a house key since. Patty, I haven't heard from. I don't expect to. Some people, when they hear this story, focus on the confrontation at the fire. They want to know if Dennis apologized publicly, if Patty ever admitted anything, if there was some final moment of accountability they can point to. I understand that instinct. We want justice to look like something visible and complete. But what I remember most is not the fire. It's the morning about 3 weeks after they left, when I came downstairs before sunrise. The house was completely quiet. The kitchen was clean the way it had been before, which is to say, the way Claire and I had left it the night before. I made coffee. I heard James starting to stir in the monitor. I went up to get him before he woke Claire. I carried him downstairs and sat in the chair by the window while it was still dark outside. Tennessee mornings in November have a particular quality to them. Cold air, bare branches, the sky going slowly from black to gray to the kind of pale blue that makes everything look freshly made. James grabbed my thumb and held it, the way babies do. I sat there in the quiet house with my son, and I thought about the things I'd told myself for 3 months. That keeping the peace was the same as protecting my family. That giving people time was the same as wisdom. That watching someone struggle from a careful distance was the same as being present. None of that was true. The peace I was keeping wasn't peace. It was just silence that cost Claire everything. There is a difference between being a patient man and being a man who uses patience as an excuse to avoid difficulty. I had been telling myself I was the first thing when I was really the second. My father used to say that a man's first job is to know what he's protecting. Not what he's managing, not what he's preserving for the sake of keeping things calm, but what he is actually responsible for protecting. He meant it in a general way, I think, but I've come to understand it specifically. I'm protecting that woman upstairs who trusted me with her honesty, even when I wasn't ready to hear it. I'm protecting this kid with his grip around my thumb who doesn't know yet that the world is complicated. I'm protecting this house that is ours, that we built together, that has a back porch and a garden and a swing set Claire is already talking about putting in the yard. Some people will hear this story and think the lesson is about cutting off family. It isn't. The lesson is about knowing the difference between helping someone and funding their comfort at the expense of someone who deserves better. Dennis is my brother. I would help him again if he genuinely needed it. But not in my house. Not in a way that asks Claire to pay the price. Those two things can exist at the same time. Love and limits can live in the same sentence. If you've been sitting in your own version of that kitchen, watching something unfair happen right in front of you and telling yourself you're being patient. I want you to hear this. Patience is a virtue. But silence in the face of something wrong is not patience. It just looks like it from far enough away. Thank you for listening, friends. And if something in this story lives somewhere close to home for you, you already know what I mean. Protecting the people who depend on you doesn't always mean fighting loudly. Sometimes it just means finally paying attention, then doing the quiet, hard thing you should have done sooner. Robert didn't save his marriage with a dramatic speech. He saved it by sitting down with his wife, saying, "I'm sorry I wasn't paying closer attention," and meaning it. That kind of honesty, offered without excuses, has a way of rebuilding more than you think it broke. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while leaving behind a lesson worth carrying into your own life.